Cool. So here we go. We're going to talk about the evidence. This is the good part of the critique. Before we get to the evidence itself, I want to remind you, we're going to talk about the link, impact, alternative, which are the three major parts of the critique. And we're also going to talk about the permutation, which if you're the negative, you have to make sure you don't lose the permutation. Before we get into that, I want to go to the argument explanation. What's the first sentence of the argument explanation? It says, the abolition critique's basic argument is that instead of trying to reform the police, we should completely get rid of them. Boom, there you go. That is what the link and the whole story of the abolition critique is the police can't be reformed. Police are inherently bad. Police do some things that really don't work as a structure. And therefore, if that's the case, then trying to reform them is never going to solve the problem. We need to find a totally different solution. So the underlying value we're talking about here is reform something that's doable or not? Can we reform or should we abolish? And that's what all these arguments are going to go back to. So let's look at the links. Remember, the link is the part where we identify the underlying values of the affirmative for the judge so that when we get to the impact and alternative, we can say why those underlying values are bad and how we can replace them. So this argument from Mariam Kaba, 2020, is the affirmative wants to keep the police and tinker with small reforms. So this is a really good example. It has some good ongoing examples in the current political climate, and it has some examples from previous years. I think this card is a little bit long. You could probably highlight it down a little bit, but the really important part of this problem is to look at all these reforms that it's talked about and to see what effect they've had. So we've done all these reforms. We've done a bunch of reforms recently. What outcome has there been? Has policing got better or has it got worse? How do we think of this, right? So this card gives some really good examples and some really good language to help articulate that to your judge. I like this card, and it's recent. Okay, next one from Sean Illig is from 2020. It says, the historical roots of policing prove it is unreformable. So this one, the last one talked about modern examples from the last 10 or 20 years. This one's talking about like the last 300 years of examples of policing and saying, you know, we've had all these problems with policing for 300 years, and we've had all these reforms that don't seem to work. They're not effective. So why aren't the reforms effective? Well, Sean Illig says there's basically an underlying value to policing that comes from where policing was established. And policing was established as a way to keep slaves under control, find runaway slaves, right? So if policing was established to do that, and policing still maintained some problems of like racism, classism, things like that, Sean's outcome here, what he believes is that because of where policing started, it's had this trickle effect through time that we haven't been able to get rid of the racism and sexism and classism that's inside the policing structure. So he says there's no way to reform that out. It's just sort of built in by this point. And he makes, 200 years, 300 years of examples to try to show that. So I think this is a good argument. I think this is an argument that's helpful for the negative, and it's definitely helpful to have, a long timeline that you can look at. And I think a lot of this card is actually really good, even the parts that are not underlined. So I would look at the parts that aren't underlined and I would read them, and I would re-highlight this card to highlight it to see what makes sense for you. Because I think it is a good card with a lot of really good data and facts and warrants, but it's really more about what you agree with and what you understand from it rather than what's already been underlined. Okay, the third one is from MPD 150. And if you've never heard of MPD 150, MPD 150 is an organization whose goal is to abolish and replace the police in Minneapolis. So MPD means Minneapolis Police Department. 150 is the amount of years that the Minneapolis Police Department has existed. So MPD 150 is like an organization that kind of looks at the last 150 years of the MPD, Minneapolis Police Department, and says, okay, what's happened? Has this been successful or not? And they conclude that it has not been successful. We should get rid of the police. So these are abolitionists. These are people who genuinely believe, we should get rid of the police. So the tag for this card is that police are beyond reform. Any effort to reform the police trades off with efforts to abolish the system and replace it with a better model. So we already know this is, if the card actually says this is a good segue to the alternative, right? Because this piece of evidence isn't just saying there's some bad underlying values. It's saying there are bad underlying values to the plan, and those underlying values make it impossible to do what we want to do in the alternative. So I think if I was reading this abolition critique, this is the piece of evidence I would read in the 1NC, because I think it makes the strongest argument for your debate argument, because it's setting up the impact and the alternative really well. I don't necessarily think that the evidence here, the text in the evidence, is better than the other two in terms of making the argument that the tag wants to make, making the uniqueness claim. But certainly once you get to the impact and the alternative, you want a card that's going to say something like, trying to do the plan trades off with trying to do the alternative. So as for the card itself, it looks at, once again, the history of policing, and it says, when we have police in our community, what does that stop us from being able to do? Well, it stops us from being able to do these social services, stops us from being able to doing other things we want. And simply the police do these things that are problematic. And if they're doing these problematic things, obviously that's part of their underlying value, right? Whether it's the individuals involved or if the structure just lets people get away with doing bad things that they shouldn't be doing, there's something wrong here. And the affirmative, I'm going to remind you, if you don't agree with all this, that's fine. These are debate arguments where we just test out different ideas. If you don't agree with this, the affirmative is going to have a bunch of answers that directly mirror this, okay? And if you do agree with this, that's great, but you're also going to have to be ready to be on the affirmative side of this argument, which doesn't necessarily mean you need to answer those arguments, but you need to find some answers. Okay, and then our fourth link is, it's from Wilson, Gilmore, and Kilgore, 2019, professors. They say that reform sucks up resources, makes abolition seem impossible, unnecessary, and they are two strategies that trade off with each other. Abolition and reform, they trade off with each other. So like the argument before this one, this is good because it says you can't do the alternative and the plan at the same time. They're incompatible, right? You can't do them together. So this is really good for setting up the impact and the alternative. And this talks about how reforms basically slow down the abolition process because it allows people to think, people see that there's problems with the policing system. I don't think most people disagree with that. No matter what part of the political spectrum you're from, there are things that happen with the police that most people disagree with. Now, those might be different parts and they might have different reasons for disagreeing about them, but I don't think anyone thinks that policing is perfect the way it is right now. The problem with how to deal with that is that the affirmative says we can make these small little changes, if we just hire the right people, fire the right people, pass a few more laws, we will perfect the system, or at least the system will be so good that it won't cause these problems anymore. Abolitionists disagree, right? They say, we've had these policing systems for 300 years. We've tried all these small changes and they haven't solved the problems. They haven't even solved the big problems that we've been talking about for 300 years. So why would we believe that more small changes are going to solve the problem this time? We need a big change. We need to just, move way far away from the system in order to stop the harms that the system is causing. So basically, this is an argument that when you make these small little reforms like the plan, it just pushes off abolition further and further and further, and it allows those bad things to continue happening in the meantime. So I think this is a good argument. It's a little bit long. The card's a little bit long. So I would definitely highlight this down to, I would read it a couple times to understand it, but then I would highlight it down to the parts that you think are the most important. Okay, those are the links. Links should, by this point, be showing that passing the plan is a reform, and that reform trades off with abolition. Because as you can probably guess already by the name of the abolition critique and how much we're talking about abolition, the negative is eventually just going to say we should abolish the police, right? So the negative links are just setting up the idea that the plan will not abolish the police. And in fact, the plan will make it take longer or make it impossible to abolish the police. Okay, so let's talk about the impact. So if reforms stop abolition, if reforms keep the police around for longer, possibly forever, what's the impact of that? Why should the judge care? Well, Michael Denzel Smith, 2015 in the New York Times. This is in Atlantic magazine. He's just a New York Times published author. That's it, no big deal. He says that our current system fails to stop crime or pursue justice. So he's saying we keep the police, he's saying his interpretation of what he's saying, your interpretation of what he's saying is going to say, when we keep the police, when we do these reforms, we basically keep the criminal justice system the way it is. We keep the police the way it is. And the way it is right now is very unjust. It's very harmful. It's very bad. So if the plan keeps things the way they are with relation to that, then they're keeping all the bad things about the system. And I think this is a pretty good card. It's very long, so I would read it and highlight it down. But it talks about some really important concepts, like what's justice? That's a question we haven't asked so far in this topic. This topic is all about the criminal justice system and the police are there to enforce laws, and laws are supposed to be the way our society decides what is just or not. So if we've gone through this whole topic and we haven't talked about what even is justice, then this is a good time to bring it up, right? Because as one of the underlying values to the plan is going to be saying, we do something that increases justice, that makes the world more just. And the negative is saying, no, you're not. You're making the world more unjust. So this card really gets to the core of that. And it asks big questions, but it also has good data in it that shows, we are not doing a very good job of having a system that takes care of people and is a just system. So the main thing he argues that we could do is to, I guess he doesn't argue this, but the outcome of this that you're going to talk about is, if the system is inherently unjust, if it's a problem, if it's doing unjust things right now, then we can't expect the system to solve that problem, right? We need a new system. We need a new concept to deal with things. And that's where you're going to be talking about the abolition alternative. Okay, Madison Pauly, 2020, Mother Jones, he is going to be talking about abolishing the police is key to a more inclusive and peaceful society. And basically, he's going to look at some very recent examples from the last 5 years, BLM and other things, where people have been trying to talk through how we're going to have a more inclusive and peaceful society. And basically, he's going to say that having the police, having criminal justice system stands in the way of being able to do that, partially because the police are, they're an option that people can take that's a less peaceful option than what we could have in the alternative, right? Like he says, we live in a culture of fear, and the police are part of that, right? When there's a problem, if people are just able to call someone and bring them over and they can enforce the law through the threat of violence, then that's not such a good thing, right? Because it means everyone has access to the potential to cause violence to other people, and all you have to do is call the police to bring them over to do it. So Madison Pauly is going to make the argument that if we want an inclusive and peaceful society, we have to move away from policing. We have to figure out other options that should be open to people so that they can engage with each other and solve serious problems without having to do it through the threat of violence, through the threat of police. Okay, next one we have is from Jasmine Wright, 2020. She's going to say abolishing the police will make society safer. In a way, the affirmative kind of already makes this argument for you, right? They say that the police carry guns, they bring in communities, they make everything more unsafe by being there. So in a way, this argument is kind of already in the debate. Jasmine Wright is just giving a different example of it. And whereas the affirmative says, well, they're unsafe because they have guns, the negative is going to say, no, it's not the guns that makes them unsafe. It is the structure of policing that makes things unsafe. So Jasmine Wright goes through a bunch of different examples about how officers are sort of the first point of contact in the criminal justice system. And then once officers put people in the criminal justice system, it's really hard to get out. Like if you get arrested, you can lose your job, you can lose your housing. If you go to jail, that's a big stigma against you. It's a problem to get like a new job and stuff like that. So even just interacting with the system when the cops come to sort of like, check up on things or whatever, it can still cause all these problems because the criminal justice system is very harmful to people that it interacts with. So even if the police aren't directly part of the problem, which is not what all the other evidence says. It says they are part of the problem. But even if the affirmative were somehow win that police aren't the problem, police still put people into the rest of this system that is very harmful to them. So Jasmine Wright says, if we just got rid of that first point, if we changed into something else that kept people out of the criminal justice system, out of prisons, out of jail, and gave them resources to manage their lives more effectively and more peacefully and beneficially, then this wouldn't be a problem anymore. So I think that's a good piece of evidence. And I think it makes a strong argument. Okay, next piece of evidence is from Nathan Robinson, 2017. He says that the criminal justice system is not a necessary evil, it's just plain evil. So this is an argument you might have thought of on your own, an argument you might hear a lot in public discussion about the police, which is that, maybe the police aren't perfect, but we don't have anything better. We need them because we don't have another way of dealing with these problems, right? So they might be bad, but they're necessary, and the alternatives to them would be worse. Nathan Robinson is saying, no, that's not the case. The criminal justice system is not a necessary evil, which is the idea that, you have to have this bad thing because you don't have any other options. He says the criminal justice system is just plain evil. So he takes a step back and he says, how do people get into the criminal justice system? How do they interact with the police? Well, usually they're causing some sort of crime or they're doing something that upsets other people. So he says, okay, if that's the case, then how do we stop crime? How do we stop people in society from being upset about things that are going on? And he basically says, if we provided people the resources they needed, then we could stop those other problems from happening. And he also makes the argument that if you agree that what happens in the criminal justice system is evil, that's bad, that we simply have to find a way around it, right? We have to try something new. Because if something really is evil, you don't just justify it until you find something new, right? You get rid of it and you figure it out. So when we say wars are evil or slavery is evil, then we're not going to say, well, okay, slavery is evil, but how are we going to do all this other stuff? No, you're just going to say slavery is evil. We need to get rid of it, and we'll figure out everything else after that, right? Well, we'll come up with a plan. We'll figure something out. But if something is obviously bad, evil, you just get rid of it, right? And you figure it out later. So I think this is an okay argument. I think you could probably make this argument after you've read another piece of impact evidence that really does more work justifying why the criminal justice system is evil. But I think this is a good sort of impact weighing argument because it shows that the magnitude of this problem is very, very large and that the judge should care about it. So those are the impacts. At this point in the story, we're basically saying because the affirmative wants to make a reform, that means that they can't abolish the police or the criminal justice system. And as a result, the impact is that the criminal justice system is very, very bad. And the affirmative allows it to continue being bad. So the alternative is going to say, instead of doing reforms, instead of keeping the criminal justice system, let's just get rid of it. So here's the actual critique alternative text, which is we should abolish the police, replace them with community workers who are trained in providing social services and restorative justice, and reject the criminal justice system as a whole. So don't do the plan, replace the police with social services, and reject the criminal justice system as a whole. So that seems in keeping with the Lincoln alternative and impact we've talked about so far. So alternative solvency. Police abolition is a process that is realistic and possible. MPD 150, 2020. This is basically just going to say, when we talk about abolishing the police and replacing them with something else, what are we talking about? What does that actually look like? How does it work? This answers all those questions, right? It's saying, okay, when we reimagine the world, here's what we reimagine it to look like. So I think this is a good piece of evidence, especially, you know, if you just say to your judge, we need to abolish the police and replace them. A judge might be like, I don't know what that means. I don't know what that results in. I don't know what that entails. This sort of answers that question. It says, who's involved? What do they do? How does it different? I think that's really good. Next one is Angela Davis from 2003. Says that there's no single alternative action. It's not like a counter plan where you just pass something and it happens. Angela Davis says that the problems that the criminal justice system is built to deal with are so varied that there needs to be many different strategies to solve the causes. So the criminal justice system is sort of like a one size fits all for all these different problems in society, like homelessness, financial laws, violence laws, basically anything you can think of that goes bad in society. We use the criminal justice system to solve it, right? And Angela Davis says, maybe that's not a good idea. Like maybe someone who cheats on their taxes is not the same as someone who is living without a home, right? And we shouldn't use the same tool to deal with both of those problems. So basically, Angela Davis is saying, instead of doing that, we need to rethink what type of society we could have and what it could look like and how it could solve those different problems. And the problems we're trying to solve, depending on how different they are and what they look like, could require different tools. So the negative is not going to be able to say, here's the 100 things we would do instead of having the criminal justice system. Instead, it's going to say, here's all the problems that we want to try to solve instead of using the criminal justice system. And we're going to have to think of alternative programs that could solve those problems better. So I think this is a really good piece of evidence. I think I would probably highlight this down a little bit to make it a little cleaner. But the one problem here is that it's from 2003, right? But the nice part is it's from Angela Davis. She's like a really important author. She's like the main abolitionist author. And also what she's arguing for here is not really time sensitive, right? Because between 2003 and now, it was a long time ago, but also the police were not really that different in 2003 than they are now. And the laws weren't really different. And there really hasn't been any change in the abolitionist movement since then and now. So even though this piece of evidence is old, it doesn't really matter, I don't think. Okay, next alternative solvency is that restorative justice can take the place of criminal punishment system to create more peaceful and more just, like justice-based ways of dealing with societal problems. And this is Vanessa Hernandez, 2016. Basically what she's saying is she's going back to the alternative wording we have, and you see it says, replace the police with community workers who are trained in providing social services and restorative justice. So we've kind of talked about social services already, right? Like helping people with welfare and housing and things like that so that they don't have these problems that would otherwise be leading them to cause, do crime or creating community problems that would cause people to call the police. But what is restorative justice? So Vanessa Hernandez talks briefly about restorative justice. She gives some examples. She talks about how it works in real life. And then she talks about other countries that have used it. And it basically says restorative justice is, instead of taking someone who's done a crime or done something wrong and putting them in jail for a couple of years to like punish them for doing it, you find that person who wronged someone else and you actually take them to those people that they wronged or the community that they've wronged, and you sort of talk it out, right? You show them how what they did hurt that community, hurt those people, and it appeals to them on a human level, right? It says, as a human, you did something bad that hurt other people. You should not want to hurt other people, right? So restorative justice is a way of helping people fix their lives and fix what they've done and what they've done to harm others to make sure they don't do that in the future. Whereas our current criminal justice system, it just has the threat of punishment for people, right? So it says, if you do something bad, we're going to punish you. And we hope that the punishment is enough to get you to not do that bad thing. So, obviously, Vanessa Hernandez and even the affirmative through their case argues that that's not a very strong, punishment is not a very strong motivator. Okay, last piece, I think, of alternative solvency. Yes, Last piece of alternative solvency is from Michael Denzel Smith, again, 2015. And he says that police can be replaced by social workers who are trained to do the same job better and with less violence. So he makes the explicit case. He makes it very clear that saying, if we get rid of the police, we can replace them with people who are trained differently, who are not going to go in communities and threaten people with violence, but instead go to communities and help people figure out the problems that they have so that they're no longer causing crime or no longer causing problems in the community that would otherwise be leading them to have the police called on them, right? So like he ends saying, it's not about getting better police. It's not about police training or reform or laws or ones who use less violence. It's getting away from needing police altogether. It's about providing people with the resources they need so that they can live lives that, you know, reduce their rate of having to do crimes or reduce the probability that they're going to cause problems in their community. And even if there are problems, sending out trained personnel to help people with the problems they're having instead of sending the police. I think that's a good piece of evidence. And then last for the negative, we're going to talk about the permutation. So again, like we talked about in the evidence, if you're using the link correctly, what you should be finding out is that the link makes a really strong argument about why you can't abolish the police and also reform them at the same time. And this permutation is basically just saying the same thing. So if you're the negative, you should choose which partner is going to read this. Is it going to be the 2NC or is it going to be the 1NR? Both of you should not read this. Only one of you should read this. And if you don't know about splitting the block by this point, you should go watch the video about splitting the block to figure out what that is and what that sounds like. And then you should look at the link evidence, extend the link evidence, and be able to explain the link evidence really well and explain why reforms and abolition don't go together. And that way you'll be able to prove that your story is true, right? That the affirmative can't be done at the same time as the negative, and that the affirmative causes some problems by trying to reform or allows some problems to continue that abolition would not cause. Okay. That's the negative. That's a lot. Let's go to the affirmative. The affirmative is basically just a mirror answer. And as we talk through this, what you're going to find out is that the affirmative, once again, has two options to try to resolve this. The first one is to turn the critique. For this one, you're basically going to read impact turns to the critique, and you're also going to answer the alternative. You're going to say the alternative doesn't solve the problem. And then the second option is to permute the critique. And that's basically just to be able to say, you can do the affirmative and the alternative at the same time. So if you can do them at the same time, you get the benefits of both, and therefore you should vote for the affirmative to pass the plan, not vote for the negative. So, and to do that, you're going to have to read answers to the link. Yeah, just answers to the link, I think. So let's talk about those link answers first of all. So our first card is from Halpin and Cook, 2010. It says that meaningful reforms can spark important social movements for progress. And he basically looks at history of reforms and says, you know, these problems we've had in society, how did we pass laws? How did we get over them to make things better? And what he identifies is that, well, to make our society better, we actually had some pretty important legal reforms, some laws that were passed. And then because those laws were passed, they led to social movements. People had more option, more opportunity to say and do what they wanted and to get momentum to create better change in society. So he's saying reforms can create social change, which means that if we reform the police to make the criminal justice system better, it actually could lead to abolition. That's what we're talking about here. The second one's from Roger Lancaster from 2015. He says that just because there are problems with the system doesn't mean it's not reformable. And he says that history and logic show this is an overly extreme position. He says it's overly extreme to say just because there's problems with the system doesn't mean it can't be made better. So he talks through, he basically these first two paragraphs are a direct answer to the uniqueness and impact arguments that are made by the negative. He says, look, there's been problems with policing, and yes, it does come from slave patrols, but policing has got a lot better over time, and it's far less harmful than it used to be. And also, the reforms that have been passed have been pretty helpful. So he says that the negative arguments really don't hold up if you look at them in historical context, and they're really not accurate. Next one's from Roger Matthews. He says that even small reforms snowball into larger reforms, which can improve the system and people's lives in a realistic and impactful way. So first he talks about, these big reform or these big abolition movements kind of really didn't go anywhere in the past, but the small reforms that have been building up over time have really done a lot to make people's lives a lot better, especially people who interact with the criminal justice system. So Roger Matthews is basically saying, the smart thing to do, the realistic thing to do is to make these reforms that make people's lives better and not focus too much on the big abolition changes that could happen, but probably aren't going to happen anytime soon. So I think this is a good argument for the negative for a lot of reasons. You can use it in a lot of different places, or for the affirmative, sorry. The fourth one is from David Cole in 2017. He says that reform efforts have reversed the harmful trends of the prison and police system, and abolition efforts haven't. So as he looks back in time on criminal justice changes, he says, who has actually created changes that have helped people who are part of the system, help society? It's not the people who are advocating for abolition, it's the people who are advocating for reforms. So if reforms have actually helped people in the past, excuse me, and the abolition work hasn't, then obviously we should continue with the reforms and not focus too much on abolition. So those are the link answers. As you can see, they really help make the case that, especially the first and third ones, make the case that reforms like the plan can lead to bigger movements like the abolitionist movement, and could make it actually happen. Whereas, in today's status quo, the way things are, it's probably not going to happen. And then the second and fourth ones basically make the argument that reforms are going to work better than trying to do a big abolitionist movement. So if you want things to actually get better, do a couple reforms first, then work towards abolition so that you can actually solve problems that are happening right now. And as we get to the permutation, you're going to see that all four of these pieces of evidence are going to be really helpful for the affirmative making the permutation argument. And that's option 2, right? Option 2 is answer the links, make a permutation, show the judge that you can pass the plan and also try to do abolition in the future, or it helps to do abolition in the future. And all four of those pieces of evidence help make that argument. Now we're going to go and talk about option 1, which is to turn the critique. So we have a couple different arguments in here. There's 3 impact turns, and 1 piece of impact defense. So the defense is basically just answering the affirmative's arguments. It's not really turning them. And what Heather McDonald 2020 is saying here is that some sort of police will always be needed and they will always have problems, right? As an institution, the police will always have problems. The best way is the question here is just best way to organize them. So if the police are always going to be part of our society and they're always going to have some sort of problem, which every institution, every part of society is never perfect, then the question is, how do we make the police as good as they can be? Not how do we get rid of them or how do we replace them, but if we're going to have them and we can reform them to be the best they can be, how do we make them the best they can be? And basically, this whole argument is just saying, the thesis of the negative is wrong. We're always going to have the police. So if we're going to have the police, we can't abolish them. The question isn't, do we abolish them or not? The question is, how do we reform them to make them as good as they can be? So this is a direct answer to what the negative is saying. And I think it's, when you read it over, the logic that Heather McDonald uses here actually makes a lot of sense. Because she's going to say that, no matter what you call it, there's going to have to be a group of people who respond to violence in society. because no matter how well off people are, they still do violence, right? If you look at lists of serial killers or you read the news or whatever, there's people who are really well off, who are super rich, who are whatever, who still do bad things. So obviously providing social resources, services to them is not going to solve these problems 100%. You're going to need a police force to solve these problems. So if you need the police, ultimately you're going to have to decide, what do those police look like? And Heather McDonald basically says, we're going to need to reform the police to make them as good as possible rather than getting rid of them. So I think that's a good argument. Second piece of impact evidence we have here is an impact turn. So it's going to say that trying to get rid of the police is bad. And that's why you don't want to do the permutation with this, right? You don't want to say that if we just do some reforms, eventually we can get rid of the police. No, you want to say that getting rid of the police is bad. We need the police. So if you're going to take this option, then this is the impact arguments you want to try to make. So Nathan Brandli, 2016, he says that abolishing the police will actually harm society's most vulnerable and let the privileged get away without consequence. And basically what he's saying is, why do the police exist? How do they fit into the concept of justice that we talked about earlier? And the conclusion he comes to is people who have a lot of privilege, who are wealthy, who are doing well in society, basically there's nothing that people who are not as well off, who don't have as much privilege can do to them, right? He uses the example of like a rich banker, I think. He says, if someone's from a really prestigious family, like they're a rich banker, their cousin is the governor or whatever, right? If you're someone who is, relatively not well off in society, and that really rich, important person wrongs you, what are you going to do about it without the police, without the criminal justice system? It's not like you can go to their friends and be like, hey, this person is bad, they did this bad, right? Like, you don't have any societal power to do anything to them. And in the world of the negative alternative, it's not clear how you would solve this problem between someone with a lot of authority and status and someone with relatively little. So he says, basically, as a society, what we've come up with is the idea that we call in a neutral, independent group of people, and they deal with this conflict so that, the relative power difference of these two people can't influence them. And that group of people is generally the police, detectives, whatever. So is that how the police actually work today? Sometimes, not all the time. But Nathan Brandli says that's a better option. Trying to get the police to actually do their jobs neutrally and correctly, that's a better option than trying to just completely get rid of the police. Because if we completely get rid of the police and the justice system, it's going to give more power to those people who are already super privileged and take away power from people who are less privileged. And therefore, it's going to hurt people more than it helps them. I think there's something to that argument. It certainly could be explained. Next impact turn is from Jacqueline Helfgott in 2020. She says that history proves that police are better than alternatives. Reform, not abolition, will solve the impacts that the critique describes. So she looks back in the last 200 years of history and she says, okay, here's why we developed the police. Here's why they exist. What happened before that? If the police are relatively new, what was the world like before police? How did we do things? And she basically said, 300 years ago, when the Industrial Revolution happened, people's lives changed a lot. And they were no longer part of like communities or societies the way we would think of them, right? Before that, people kind of lived in little communities, little towns, and they knew everyone who lived around them. Maybe they had like a feudal lord or whatever who ruled over them, but everybody knew each other and everybody knew how they were connected to each other, whether it was family or religion or, legal stuff, commercial stuff, economic stuff, things like that. That's not the case anymore, right? Some people don't even know the person who lives 2 doors down from them because we all are basically uprooted and move around so often that we don't really know people in our community. So if we don't have the option to reach out to our community anymore because we don't know anyone in our community anymore, then basically we need a neutral third party to be able to come in and solve problems in our community that would otherwise be happening, right? And basically, Jacqueline Helfgott says those people are the police. They're the criminal justice system. So because we don't really know each other in our communities anymore, and we can't hold each other accountable, there's not much we can do except appeal to a third party to come in and help us. And that third party has to have the authority of the government, which is the police. And anything else we've tried other than that in these new societies we live in doesn't really work. Okay, and then the fourth one is from Jeremiah Mosteller, I don't know, from 2020. He says that abolishing the police will make society more unsafe. And basically what he talks about is what we talked about in the first card. There's some people in society that just do violent things. They're just violent, they're dangerous, they do bad things. How do we deal with them? If they can't be influenced or persuaded by the restorative justice techniques or through having enough resources to meet what they want to do in their lives, to meet, being able to survive and live and stuff, if they're just going to do bad things anyway, how do we deal with people like that? Well, we need some group of people who has the authority to use violence to stop them, right? To either stop them before they do something or to stop them after they've done something and bring them in so that they don't continue doing bad things. And basically, Jeremiah says that no matter what you call them, that group of people is the police. So in a world of abolition, he asks, who does that in the world of abolition? If there's no police, how do we deal with that problem? And basically says, abolitionists don't have any way of dealing with that problem. They either let it happen, let it continue to happen, or they get some sort of police form organization going on, in which case it's not really that different from what the affirmative is trying to do, right? It at least shows that the affirmative and the negative can meet halfway here. Okay, so that's option one and option two, the big pieces for it. Now we have arguments about alternative solvency. And if you're going for option one, to say that there's no link to the plan can lead to abolitionism in the future, you might want to read some of these because you might still just want to be able to say, the alternative won't work on its own. We need to do the plan, then try to do the alternative. And if you're reading option two, which is just the impact turns, you definitely want to read these because you want to be able to say that the negative doesn't solve the problem that they put out, but the affirmative does solve the problems they put out, right? So first one is No Alternative Solvency from Michael Shermer, 2018. He says that big utopian changes like the critique always fail. If you don't know what utopian means, don't worry about it. It's actually defined in the card here. But utopia basically just means like the perfect place or the good place, right? So Michael Shermer is saying that these big radical changes, they don't work. The world doesn't work that way. Basically, he's saying you can't go from point A to point Z in one step. You have to take all these little steps to build up structures, to build up community, to build up different ways to make the world work so that you eventually can get to point Z. So he says we need to do reforms so that we can get to big changes, and that try and do those big changes on their own, like the alternative does, doesn't work. Okay, next one is Bill Keller, 2019. He says that the alternative fails because the societal conditions required for abolition do not exist and will never exist. So basically he's saying for restorative justice and community justice and all these things to work, people have to actually live in a community and they have to trust each other and they have to want to work with each other. That doesn't exist right now. People don't know their communities. People don't trust each other. People are individuals or families in the community. They don't work together. So therefore, if that's the case, trying to do the alternative, even if you passed whatever laws were required to do it, it still wouldn't work because our society just isn't ready to live in that type of environment yet. We're not ready for those types of big changes. So even if the negative gets to make the argument that they make laws or whatever that do it, it might still fail because the society isn't ready for it yet. So I think this is a pretty strong argument because I think it's actually, relatively true. The vast majority of people aren't ready to live in a society where they are not able to call the police. And whether that's a good thing or not is, we can debate that. It's a different thing. But I think Bill Keller is making a pretty strong argument here that when you look out to who actually exists, what the world is actually like, most people are not ready for this yet. And I think most judges will agree with that, whether you think that's good or not. Next one is from Craig and Pond, 2020. It says that public support is critical to success and the public is overwhelmingly against abolition. So this is a little bit similar to the other one. It basically says that the public does not think that the alternative would work. So even if the alternative is true in the abstract, that without the police, the world would be better, that's only true if people are ready to accept a world without the police and they're ready to work with each other and actually do what needs to be done to have a world without police. And Craig and Pond basically say, you know, when you look out, when you ask people, they say they're not ready for this, they don't want this, and it's not going to work even if we were to able to pass the laws that could create abolition. Next one is no alternative solvency. Businesses and wealthy will just hire personal security instead of doing the alternative. Davidson, 2020. I think this is a pretty good argument because what the negative wants to do is they want to get rid of the police who exist at the state level, right? Either from the national or state governments. And this piece of evidence basically asks the question, okay, if you did that, what would happen? If the government just got rid of all of its police and changed other services, how would business owners feel? How would people who own property feel? How would individuals feel? Well, the result, at least in today's environment, would be that probably most individuals and businesses would hire their own security who would do the role that police currently do, right? And those people are going to be less accountable and less constrained by laws than the police are. So basically he's saying, if you think things are bad now with police who work for the government, imagine police that work for corporations or individuals. It's going to be way, way worse than what we have right now. So basically he's saying that, or rather the result of this is if we got rid of the state police and we got worse police from individuals or private companies, then obviously the result is we should not get rid of police. We should reform them to just be better at policing, right? I think those are pretty strong arguments. And they clash with the core of the negative proposal and the core of what the negative outcome is going to be of trying to do the alternative. So once again, if we go back to alternative one, or the option to say that the plan doesn't link and that it could cause reform or it will cause reform in the short term, which might cause abolition in the long term, then the main argument you need for that is this permutation. And the permutation says, permutation, do the plan as a first step towards abolition. And it says, you know, if we do the plan, we can do some criminal justice reform, which will lead to more reforms, which could lead to abolition and a much better system. Therefore, there's no reason to do the critique instead of the plan. And if you look at all the link arguments we made before, they really help pave the way to make this argument, right? They say these reforms like the plan can lead to big reforms, big alternatives, or that trying to go straight to the big alternative doesn't work. You have to do small reforms first. So make sure you read the permutation if you're going to go for this option, but make sure you do not read the impact turns if you do this, right? Because if you're going to say doing reforms will lead to abolition and the impact turns say that abolition is bad, then that means that your case reforms are going to lead to something bad, right? So don't read those two arguments together. Choose what option you want and make sure you pursue that option. So I hope this evidence makes a little bit more sense. And I hope that you are able to talk with your partner and your coach about what option you want to take as the negative and as the affirmative, and how you're going to help, what arguments you're going to read to make that happen. So before we sign off here, just a reminder, if you're the negative, you need one piece of link, one piece of impact, and one piece of alternative to tell a full story. And you should make sure that those three pieces of evidence go together really well. So you can tell the story about how the underlying problem of the affirmative is that they believe that reforms will lead to a better world, whereas the negative says reforms don't work, only abolition works, and this alternative is what's going to get us there. So good luck, happy debating, and I hope you enjoy this argument.